Good morning, everybody. So first of all, why am I here? And as Tim's explained, I've reported on European food legislation for more than 20 years. I currently edit EU food policy, which I launched 5.5 years ago, which is an online news service which brings readers the latest news and the policy from Brussels. I follow the proposals put forward by the European Commission, the debates and the votes in the European Parliament, the deliberations in the Council by Member State ministers. And I also cover the agendas and the outcomes of the Standing Committee, Plants, Animals, Food and Feed. And this is a very secretive committee, in my view, and it decides a lot of food legislation based on a proposal from the Commission by a qualified majority vote. It meets in private. It's often very difficult to find out what it's discussing. The Commission never reveals how any of the member states votes. And sometimes, even at the end of the deliberations, it's sometimes quite difficult to work out for a while what everyone's agreed. And I also cover the voluntary initiatives, such as the Platform for Action on Diet, Physical Activity and Health. And my main concern about Brexit is, as several other speakers have already said, the UK would have no say in the future over either new or amended food legislation. And I think everyone assumes that if the UK left the EU, British food and drink firms would still want to export to the single market. And without Britain, that single market is probably about 450 million consumers. So in order to do that, companies have to meet all the requirements of the EU rules, otherwise their products couldn't be sold. But in effect, they would have no say in future over these rules. So at the moment, for example, the UK, it has substantial voting power in the Council. It has substantial voting power in the Standing Committee, and it would lose all of that. In the Standing Committee, which I referred to earlier, at least at the moment, it's in the room, it can build alliances, and to either support or to block new laws or changes to existing laws. And this committee, it can often change the word, just change one or two words in a food law right at the last moment. The Commission wants to get a qualified majority. In order to get that, it will change a couple of words in the text. We had this with health claims, where at the 11th hour, some of the key conditions of use were changed by one or two words. And that can make the difference, really, between whether a company can use that health claim or not, whether it meets the conditions of use. And how on earth would you be able to operate if not only you're not in the room, but you might not even have access to the documents? You might not even be, you would not know how they were going to change things. So I think it would make life very difficult. The UK would have no MEPs, no say in the European Parliament. MEPs, as well as power on co-decision. They also have the right to veto some of the Commission implementing rules under the old system and the new delegated acts. For example, there's about to be a veto attempt on 3 food delegated acts next week on baby milk, baby foods and medical foods. But without MEPs, the UK would have no access to the European Parliament. There'd also be no British officials over time in the Commission. We had Robert Madeline, Director General of DG Sante, as it's known now, previously DG Sanko. He was head there for 5 years, and he's now in charge of innovation in the Commission. So I think Britain would be fairly powerful. Even if it became part of some kind of economic area, like Norway, it might be consulted at early stages on drafts, but that's very different from being involved. Some people argue, we've heard it today, that EU food legislation is a bureaucratic nightmare imposing endless administrative burdens on small businesses. And people say that one advantage of leaving the EU might be to make the laws easier for British companies. But the British firms would have to meet the EU laws to export to the EU. And I think that if the British government, after a Brexit, were to make exemptions or concessions, for example, on slaughterhouses or hygiene, that would be a very dangerous route to take. You'd very quickly have countries like France or Poland or Germany or whoever saying, our food is safer than yours. And that would make exports difficult. Here we have the bendy cucumber. I think that a lot of the excesses of Brussels are long gone. You know, you are now allowed to sell bendy cucumbers. If they're not in the supermarkets, it's because the supermarkets don't think consumers want to buy them. And the new European Commission, led by Jean-Claude Juncker and Vice President Frans Timmermans, they absolutely hate new food legislation. They really don't want any more. In fact, the opposite. They're reviewing the general food law. They're reviewing the nutrient profiles in the health claims law. They're reviewing health claims on botanicals. You know, they're very, very reluctant to propose anything new, even on something like trans fat, where you know, the idea of setting a limit on trans fat, industrial trans fat in processed food. Almost all the sectors, the different stakeholders want legal limits. Mars wants them, Mondelez wants it, Nestlé wants it, European HeartNet wants it, consumers want it. But even when there's very, very strong agreement from the stakeholders, the Juncker Commission is still really quite reluctant to propose something, though it has now finally come out with a report. And the Juncker Commission, you know, they like alcohol legislation even less, I think, than they like food legislation. So, you know, don't expect any new laws on things like calorie labelling for alcoholic drinks anytime soon. So I think that if Britain wants a review of key EU food legislation, now is really the time to demand it, and it's much easier and better to be inside and on the inside track than on the outside. I think also there's a whole debate about risk assessment and the European Food Safety Authority. You know, how much is it going to cost Britain to duplicate all that? On a final note, a word on consumers. I think EU food legislation, it may well not be perfect, but on the whole, it has resulted in a safe food supply. Consumers have, in my view, been served quite well. And as I said before, if the British government started relaxing British food laws, you know, consumers might feel that they weren't so safe. One argument, and this is my final point, that I've heard people argue, is that if Britain left, it could make the traffic light label mandatory, and it could also impose statutory limits on the amounts of sugar in food, part of the campaign to fight obesity. But personally, I think you can justify the voluntary traffic lights under existing EU rules. Although the Commission has questioned the traffic light under a lot of pressure from countries such as Italy, so far it hasn't actually taken the UK to court. And I think that, you know, you can justify, as long as you're prepared to make your case. You've got the wording in food information regulation. You've also got the ability to actually act on public health grounds. So personally, I think that, you know, that argument doesn't really hold up very well. Anyway, thank you very much for listening to me. And also, thank you very much to Tim for inviting me.